Dot is always a fun team to use because we get to see enemies explode when they take their turns. A different kind of satisfaction from dealing tons of crit damage on our hyper carry DPS. It would have been so much more fun if Star Rail is not a time-bound game, but it is what it is. Dot at the beginning of the game was one of the weirder team to use due to how slow the damage is being dealt, because we had to rely on the enemy taking their turns. But eventually, Kafka was released, and her kit truly changes on how Dot operates as she triggers dots outside the enemy turn. And this gets even better as Black Swan was released, solidifying the team as a very competent team due to how easy to apply dots with Black Swan. But now, we are at version 3.x in Amphorius, and the enemies is getting faster, tankier, and stronger, and also able to keep spawning minions. Because of that, Dot as a team struggles to adapt with the recent meta as the playstyle of Dot is too slow, especially if we evaluate them solely from the character kit, and most players will use the characters with 4-star light cones. However, there's hope yet, with Hycelan is on the horizon, and especially Kafka's buff is finally here and finalized, and we shall see if these buffs will somewhat revitalize Dot team and maybe even fix the Dot team. So for Kafka's buff, the first one, now with her skill, instead of only triggering the dot on the main target, her skill now also triggers the dot on the adjacent enemies. Personally, I really like it because dot relies on enemies to take their turns in order to deal damage, as I've mentioned over and over again in this video and my previous video. Because with her skill only triggering one target, and she had to rely on her ultimate when it comes to dealing with waves of enemies, causing Dot team to be a rather slow team in most situations compared to other DPS team, as combat, especially bosses and elite enemies, are getting tougher to fight. Now with the skill being buffed, we can speed up the damage process a bit faster. At second buff, now her follow-up attack will be triggered not just from basic attack, but from all attacks. And now, it also has 2 charges. What's very good about this buff is that now her follow-up attack also triggers dots. Not to mention, now using her ult, it allows her to recover 1 charge of follow-up attack. You know what this means? Kafka now can detonate dots with all of her actions. Crazy good. I think this is actually her best buff. As I mentioned in my dot problem video, Dot suffers from a slow gameplay due to Dot inherently is not detonatable, and they relies on the characters to do it, while Kafka is the only character that can achieve that universally regardless of the element. Even back then, she can only rely on her skill and ultimate to detonate the dot, which makes Dot team somewhat quite a headache to play when it comes to skill point management. I always find myself on edge because I had to decide whether I should save my skill points for healing or push for a bit more damage. But now, with how almost all of her action will cause dots to detonate, it makes Dot to be a much faster team, and also we have a bit more breathing room with the skill points. Lastly, for her core kit, now if allies' effect hit rates are higher than 75%, she increases their attack by 100%, replacing her previous trace of only triggering all dot types with her ult. Now, that has been added to her ultimate by default. This is mad good, as it boosts overall damage of the Dot team, since all of them currently is attack scaling, or even any support that benefits from attack boost, like Rabbit for example. Unfortunately though, if in the future there's going to be a HP or defense scaling Dot character, they will not be benefited from this. So in the future, there's a chance that Kafka might not be a universal Dot super anymore. But we can assume that at the moment, the devs have no plan in making Dot characters except with attack scaling, so we don't have to worry about that anytime soon. I'm a bit worried about their squishiness, especially 4-star characters, because Dot will really benefit from having many different characters, so players can experiment with different types of dots. But perhaps we can get a specialized dot sustain at some point. I'm hoping it will be Constance around version 3.7 or 3.8, so we can have all of the hot ladies in one team. Kafka, Black Swan, Highlands, and maybe Constance. Pretty good, huh? I think that is very possible. We had Lingsha as a super break sustain. Why can't we have dot sustain? In the previous beta version, the effect hit rate thing was dot damage buff by 75% instead of 100% attack buff, which is a huge damage boost exclusively for dot team. Changing them makes sense since 75% straight dot buff is very powerful, and that allows Kafka to be played with featured dot characters that scales off HP or even defense. But now it is unlikely, as I've mentioned. And for her last buff, it's an update on her Eidolons. Her Eidolon one is not pretty solid as it can be triggered easily just with normal attack and only with around 30% dot boost value when Kafka attacks, which is a very powerful thing as well. Lastly, her Eidolon 2, she can get attack boost for 25% up to 2 stacks after using her follow-up attack, boosting her personal damage even further. Those who are lucky enough to get her multiple Eidolons or whales will get a lot of benefit out of her thanks to this Eidolon buff. I'm actually fine with this change during the beta because if the developers do end up releasing dot character that scale off HP and defense in the far future, now we can have two distinct dot teams, one led by Kafka and the other one will be led by different character. More varieties is always better in my opinion. After seeing all of the buffs, honestly, I really like the buffs that they gave Kafka here. All of the current buffs are given to not only boost her personal damage, but also elevates the other dots character damage, and most importantly, making dots a much faster team. Thanks to Kafka able to detonate buffs with all of her actions except basic attack. These are much needed buff for a dot team that currently has very limited options on how the team can compete with the other teams, except if you're mega whaling or have all the light codes. Unlike Blade's buff that I personally find to be a bit boring, but it does work for him. I'm happy for the players who are satisfied with it. These buffs are very good for Kafka, as we see her doing more stuff now, with changing how her skill works, and also her follow-up attacks now is more flexible and can be dish out more often thanks to extra charges and recovering charge from ultimate, instead of being locked into a teammate basic attack. I always find that the OG Kafka's talent is a bit underwhelming compared to the rest of her kit. With that being said, I still have a little bit of problem with this, not exactly related to her kit. My only problem at the moment is that I really think that Kafka should be added into the permanent banner so that all players can have access to the key enabler character for Dot team. Without Kafka, Dot is still going to struggle, as I mentioned in my Dot video, on how Dot is such a character-dependent playstyle as it lacks characters options, and Kafka carrying the team really hard. So if Hoyoverse refuses to make Kafka into a standard banner, at least put her into rotation in the 50-50 options when you try to roll for the limited time banner, much like Blade, eventually. Well, that's my opinion regarding Kafka's buff. How are you guys liking the buff? Let me know in the comment section. Are you happy? Do you wish for something more? Or you're a bit disappointed? Let me know. I'm really curious about what the player base thinks about this particular buff. With that out of the way, now I'm going to talk about what buff did I expect for her. But know that Kafka's buff has been finalized. Perhaps this idea can be used on featured character kit instead. Feel free to stay if you like listening to some creative thinking. But if you're here for just Kafka's buff, I thank you all for watching and look forward to see my next video on who should be buffed next. So subscribe so you'll be notified when the video is up. Anyway, let's continue with how I would have buffed Kafka. My overall idea is pretty much aligned with how the devs decided to buff her, which is doubling down on her role as both applicator and key characters to trigger them. My first idea was made with Hule and Amphorius in mind, where there are multiple tanky enemies with some of the elite can resummon the mid-sized enemies. And also, in Apocalyptic Shadow and Pure Fictions, we are fighting multiple enemies and we have to keep applying new stacks of dots, and this can be a very annoying process. So, in order to tackle that, I was thinking along the line, make it so that now Kafka also apply a special electric dot, much like Black Swan unique wind dot, the Arcana. I was thinking that this can only be applied using her ultimate and follow-up attack, while her skill is still being used for dot detonation. The way it works, there can be a total up to 6 to 7 stacks in the field, meaning if there are 5 enemies in the field, 1 or 2 enemies can have 1 extra stack. And each stack acts like a 1 stack of shock. You can stack any enemies and the stack will be automatically distributed to enemy that still doesn't have a stack. And if it was using ultimate, all enemies will be inflicted with this dot. The moment an enemy die, the stack will go to the other enemy. So if originally there were 5 enemies and one of them died, so one other enemy that only has 1 stack now has 2 stacks. So when there's only one enemy, that enemy can accumulate up to 6 to 7 stacks, which can be a very big damage, just like Black Swan's Arcana. So if you want to give a comparison, it is basically enemies are connected with her spider webs, and that acts as a electrical circuit, meaning more dots means more current flows. As long as there's still enemy with this dot on the field, if a new enemy comes up, they will be immediately be inflicted with 1 stack of this dot taken from another enemy with the highest stack. So she kinda acts like an erudition of a dot that always inflict enemies with dots without having to do much chore except when you just started the fight and if the duration expires. To make it a bit balanced, if the enemy is not killed within 2 turns, Kafka needs to reapply the dot. It sounds a bit too complicated, isn't it? Which is why I think it is better to just buff the dot mechanics as a whole. Check my previous video for a long discussion about it, and many discerning viewers have provided insightful comments, so join us. My second idea will be add a second follow-up attack into her kit. This has been addressed somewhat in the current beta buff, but my version, instead of using the same follow-up attack with more charges, add a new follow-up attack that triggers on a different condition. They can use the grenade animation from the boss version of her, and my idea is that this can be triggered after the maximum stack of dot is reached, and it will detonate all dots. I guess there is just a different take on how dot can evolve. Instead of detonating dots more often like what the current buff is, it detonates really big dots after a long setup. I truly think that this is a direction worth exploring if the developers want to mess around with dot a bit more. More damage through quick actions, or one instance of a really big damage. And my last idea was that I was hoping she would use Spirit Whisper to buff allies during combat, much how her Apocalyptic Shadow version buff another enemies. So basically, after another Nihility character uses their ult, either their attack will be boosted or their damage will be boosted through the Spirit Whispers. I suppose in the final buff, it was done through the effect hit rate threshold thing, and that is fine too. I just preferred that it is achieved through combat instead of equipment setups or relic setups. I understand that this means the devs need to add more animation for an old character, but I think it is fine to reuse animation from the enemy version to the playable version. And I have one more bonus, probably a bit wild and perhaps better for a completely new character or for a new Kafka's path. Add her Spirit Whisper mechanic for the player, the one that can mind control, essentially like turning the enemy into a Memo Sprite, and they are controlled like the one in Ethereum Wars. Make it so that it doesn't work on big boss enemy though, otherwise it will be too overpowered. So in the character menu, Kafka can select up to 3 enemies to select from. 1 small, 1 medium size, and 1 elite enemy from specific pool of enemies that we need to defeat first or hunt in the overworld if you want to use them. If we want to translate this into traditional RPG terms, make her as a tamer or a blue mage. Perhaps if there's going to be a remembered Kafka, this could be her kit. But make it so that it is for free. So all players can go around and hunting enemies to add them into Kafka's collection. Pretty fun idea, right? Well, that's that. We already know what Kafka's kit is going to be, but if you had the chance to be the designer of her own buff, how would you like to design Kafka's buff? Leave your thoughts in the comment section. Once again, I really like what the devs do with Kafka here, and perhaps it will make Dot to stay relevant if devs don't go too crazy with how the enemies work moving forward. I still hope that one day the devs address the problem and potential that Dot has as a mechanic and stop it from being too character dependent, because there's a chance that Dot will be power crap again in the future. As I mentioned previously, we're going to talk about the next 5 characters that needs to be buffed, so stay tuned. And also, if you're interested in me doing something similar like this video but with Jing Liu, do let me know and I will consider making a video for it. Thanks for watching, and in the next video, stay sharp gamers.